I have very recently stepped out of a career of 43 years, a part of which has been in housing, in local authority housing, and in a very large housing association that I set up 18 years ago to buy all of the local council's housing, about 7,500 homes in Huntingdonshire, and we've grown across Cambridgeshire since then. However, a part of my life, a very substantial part, was in London, and I was able to experience firsthand the nature of life on large local authority housing estates, the ones that you see often, I think, parodied in documentaries and in soap operas, the place where all the very worst people in the country live, the ones who siphon off all of our hard-earned taxes, the ones who don't look after their families. There's an element of truth in that. I'm not trying to be sarcastic, but of course that is what we associate often with high-rise housing. The background to housing in this country in terms of affordable homes, stuff that we've just heard about here, is that from about the mid-19th century, housing associations mostly started off by Christian philanthropists, built large estates. Some of them are still being run by organisations like the Guinness Trust, Peabody, and the like. And after the First World War, Lloyd George said, we want to have 500,000 homes fit for heroes, because people were returning from the war and they needed housing. There was a major demolition campaign that took place in the Second World War, care of the Nazi Luftwaffe, as Hitler bombed all of the major cities. And so from the late 1940s up to the end of the 1950s, there were major house building programs. In the latter part of the 1950s, through into the 1960s and the very early part of the 1970s, Britain embarked upon a program of building high-rise housing. It had worked elsewhere, so they thought. It looked very good, large amounts of concrete. Concrete was very much in vogue, and therefore why... I'm not being rude to any architects here, just to be certain about it. But in the brutalist style, as it was called, they built these tower blocks. And what happened was the pattern of building tower blocks was replicated right across the country in all of the major cities. One big problem: they had inherent difficulties associated with the actual structure of the buildings, quite apart from the social problems that arose. And so the problems in terms of technology were replicated right across the country. At the same time, as these large local authority housing estates were being built, they were primarily being built on the edge of towns. And they were vast, they were sprawling, there were huge open spaces, and a range of problems arose around them, which now are really an epithet for council housing or social housing. One of the biggest problems, and there is a case for high-rise living, because it's actually quite popular now, especially amongst young professionals. So density, given the problems in urban areas of having affordable homes and transport, if you're building into the sky, you can increase the number of homes you have on a relatively small footprint, and people can live and work nearby. Architecture, in some cases, nowadays, there are signature schemes. There's one built by Goldfinger in North Kensington. Trade Tower, you'll see it, you'll probably have seen it on some of the films. It's the one which has a huge lift shaft on the outside of it. Very popular now with young professionals. But he had also built another property in Tower Hamlets, exactly the opposite. So there are some properties where it works. Greenbelt, preventing urban sprawl and protecting the countryside. These are all potentially good reasons for building high-rise housing today. Sometimes people feel also that community can be built because it's a fresh start for an area. You'll see that in places like the Paddington Basin. And of course, modern technology does lead us to improved design. Often what is happening is pods are being built, and then they're craned in to the infrastructure of a building, high quality, with all the white goods you need. Of course, in any situation where a community is being displaced, and people say it's a fresh start, the rest of the local community may actually see that as being the local authority and all the agencies of the state saying we failed, and we have to start afresh. And of course, one of the biggest reasons for people moving into high-rise housing are the views, because you can see so well. However, against that, and this was true then and it's true today, repairs are incredibly more costly. It's about 10 times more expensive to refurbish a property in a tower block than it is something on street level. Imagine the difference in cost between replacing windows in your standard 3-bedroom semi-detached house and doing it 20 floors up. Security is of course a major problem, because one of the difficulties that arise in tower block living, in high-rise living, and this was particularly true of affordable homes, is that once you get in through the front door, and for many years they didn't have controlled entry systems, they didn't have any controlled access, you're up through the lift. Often a lift was damaged. I've rarely been in a lift in a high-rise building owned by a local authority which didn't smell of something unmentionable, and where you might even see those unmentionable things in the lift. But then you get into your corridor, you shut your door, and who else do you know? You're living on a street in the sky. And whereas you might have enjoyed gardens and having conversations with people across your garden fence now, these vast spaces around tower blocks have no ownership, no defensible space as they're described. They're anonymous, and the people who come in and out of tower blocks are also anonymous. Hence the reason for such a high level of crime in those properties. In tower blocks there are no twitching curtains. There's no one looking out because there's nowhere to look out. Location. Fashionable areas, as I mentioned earlier today, are popular. But there are many places, especially because local councils directed that families should go and live there, where those places are seen as being unpopular and in some cases actually as no-go areas. And families, of course, are really not suited for high-rise housing because of the lack of open space and the lack of gardens. Now, there have been a number of schemes, and I was involved in them in the 1980s as well, that have sought to tackle some of this. So in the late 70s and the early 80s, I was working in the London Borough of Ealing on a large estate. You can Google this, South Acton, and one of the things I was seeking to do, working with the community, so it's very relational in that sense, was to try and build confidence between them and the local authority and the agencies of state. I went to a meeting one evening at a community centre, and I could not see my way to the front because it was filled with smoke. However, when I made my way through the haze, what I saw were people who looked very angry. And if someone had a rope with a loop the size of my neck, I would have thought, that's for me. Because that's how they felt. Disenfranchised, forgotten, left behind by anyone who had power and authority. Over the next few years, I worked with that community. And in 1981, some of you may remember, we had the Brixton riots, the Toxteth riots, the problems in Bristol, St Paul's, Handsworth. But on these large estates in Acton, not a single petrol bomb was thrown. The reason for that was that people had begun to build relationship and trust had formed. So I do think there is the basis for that to happen. And in just a minute, I'll give you some key points which I think might help us in understanding this relationally. But here is something which is very interesting. It seems that the higher that we build, the less we relate to people. So there seems to be an inverse proportion to height and in terms of vertical living and horizontal living. The higher we go, the less we know who our neighbours are. It seems logical, but the outcome of it is that in something like 300,000 homes across this nation, because that's about the number of high-rise buildings, people do not know how to relate to one another. And an entire generation or more has grown up in that situation. So I think it's time to renew. And there are potential interventions and things that need to happen to enable us to solve the problem of high-rise housing. Why this is so important is because actually it does affect large areas of our cities. There are physical interventions that need to take place for certain, and so architectural changes within housing estates and, dare I say, recladding of buildings. So that was very popular in the 70s because people were putting on coloured cladding to give people the impression that this was a new estate. They'd even renamed it. But of course now, in the wake of Grenfell Tower and similar buildings which have this aluminium composite material, there are grave concerns. So physical interventions are important, but there are a number of others that I think will help us as well. The first is vision. In any community, people need to understand or have some sense that we want things to be different. We do speak about Britain being broken. The brokenness extends right across the international community. But here, in this, the fifth largest community in the world, economic community in the world, we have so much wealth and we have an inability to heal our communities. So vision, and the vision isn't only do we know what the answer is, I think it starts with an aspiration, which we have in our hearts and which we can build in others. Understanding, which is also an acknowledgement of what the problems are. There is a tendency amongst people who are in government, in local government, in regulatory bodies, to fail to acknowledge the nature of the problem. I have been severely criticised by some people for using the term broken Britain, because we don't want to talk about the brokenness of Britain, but it is broken. Desire and will are key, and these are potentially emotional responses, but they are the things that are lacking in the great agencies of state. Leadership, of course, where not just individuals but communities, as in the case with this community land trust, where people are prepared to say, we will take leadership. Working together. It was Tony Blair who was recognised for using the term joined up thinking, but I think he was actually at a conference I was speaking at, and he took hold of it. And this is interesting, because a few years after that, I was giving a talk, and I said to all the people there, I said, look, when I say this, when I say can we do it, I want you to say yes we can. So we did that. Barack Obama. Next I see, there's a rapper singing my theme, and Barack Obama gets appointed to the White Office. So, you know, if you want a position to stay, come to one of my conferences. We do need to work together. We do need to own the problem. That's a big deal, because earlier there was this terrible story about a child that had died, and that situation has been repeated again and again because of these silos in which particularly public agencies work. The willingness to empower. Back in the 1970s and 80s, the challenge I had was to work with local authority councillors and the officers to say, look, the only way we're going to deal with these very severe problems, which in that area were primarily between the black community and the police. They had something called the sus law at that time, which meant that a policeman could arrest anyone if they just had a reasonable suspicion, or just suspicion. And the most suspicious thing that could happen on the streets of London was you were black and you were young. And that was the case for arrest. And that is what led, primarily along with economic and housing and educational problems, to the Brixton and other riots. So the need to empower people has to come, or the openness, from those who control the power. A commitment to change. This is a big deal. Are we prepared to change in our communities? Are we prepared to change the way in which we manage budgets, for example, where we devolve money to local communities to enable them to spend on the things that are their priority? That kind of consultative approach still doesn't sit well in our system. The capacity to deliver, I believe the capacity is there. Human capital is the one thing that repeatedly governments have failed to understand. It's the economy, stupid, is always the mantra, but it's never the economy, and you are stupid, because the real capital resides in the capacity of the human spirit to win through. If people are given half an opportunity in terms of leadership, where someone says, this is the way we should go, let's walk in it, that's the answer. And that produces the capacity to deliver, but it has to be matched with perseverance. We have to have that sense of saying, yeah, we're going to do every single lap until we get there. It's something that I call the road to renewal, and it takes us forward to enable us to achieve change. Accountability is very important. Every person within our communities, from elected politicians through to children, need to find what that means. And that's a whole renaissance of experience that we need in our society. And finally, it's people. That's what I mentioned earlier. It is people that will make the difference. If we can inspire hearts and minds, as you are doing there, is that the Love Psalm estate? Well, you know, that estate was beginning to become a bit of a byword for a lost cause. And here we have evidence of people being brought into that sense of vision that we can make a difference. So the case for and against high-rise housing, really the case is primarily against it, but it's popular with some, but it is not the way forward for the majority of families. That's the point, although it does make economic sense to build. So if we are going to find a way to solve some of these problems, especially in urban centres, I think the best way, the very best way to predict the future is actually for us to invent it now. And we invent it by creating strong relationships where we bring the agencies of state and business together in order to produce a better future. It's something that can be done where there's a will, because there's always a way. Can we do it?
Yes,
we can. Thank you very much.